I think a lot of the fake science problems come from a lack of transparency. Sometimes we don't know exactly what's under the hood of the research. So when you go deeper into the layers of how the research was done, you realize that maybe you shouldn't trust it. So the point is, how much transparency is there? When you see a report by a consulting firm, or you're watching the news, or you're reading a scientific article, are the details of how the study was done sufficiently transparent so that you can evaluate the quality of that research?
That's really interesting. Are you seeing examples of this in our field? Have you seen, picked up a research report, and you don't have to name names, but have you picked one up and said, oh, this could be questionable? Welcome to International Business Today, where we discuss the most critical issues in international business with top academic experts and thought leaders. I'm Paula Kellijuri, a professor in the International Business and Strategy Group at Northeastern University's DeMoore McKim School of Business. Today, I am so happy to be joined by Herman Aguinis. Herman is the Avram Tucker Distinguished Scholar and Professor of Management at the George Washington School of Business. He's internationally recognized for his award-winning research in the areas of global talent management, workforce diversity, and research methods. Herman, welcome to International Business Today.
Thank you, Paula. Delighted to be here.
Yeah, I am so excited to talk to you about this idea of research methods and science, fake science, right? We hear about fake news all the time, but lately we're starting to see a lot more headlines around scientific results that actually weren't. So can you tell us how that affects us in international business?
Sure. So I like data.
Right?
So just a few months ago, an article was published in the journal Nature. You probably heard of Nature.
Sure, of course.
Science, those are very prestigious journals.
Right.
So they reported that in the year 2023, 10,000 articles from scientific journals had to be retracted. What is the meaning of a retraction? It means that a paper that went through the review process was published, was made available to the public, and then that paper, we discovered that there were some fatal flaws that made that research untrustworthy, unreliable. So the paper was retracted, meaning withdrawn, taken out of circulation. Essentially fake science. 10,000 articles. To put things in perspective, in 2022, only 4,000 were retracted. So we see a huge increase in fake science.
Alarming.
Yes.
That's alarming. Are you finding that true also in business?
Yes. And there are many cases in the area of business, international business, in management, and it's happening everywhere, in every field of science.
Oh my goodness. That's really very tragic. And how do we become, how do managers, people who are listening to this, global leaders, global professionals, how do we become better and more educated consumers of research? I mean, how do we know if it's fake or not, right?
Thank you for asking that question, because I just wrote an article, and actually many articles in a book that was just published.
Oh, we'll have to get that.
Thank you. I had to put the plug in there.
Of course, no, we'll put it in the show notes.
It's titled Research Methodology, Best Practices for Rigorous, Credible, and Impactful Research. And the book is for researchers, but also for consumers of research. And it starts from the beginning. What kinds of questions are you asking in your research? Are you really answering these questions or not? Are you testing these hypotheses or not? Then how do you collect the data? What measures are you using? Are you really measuring what you think you're measuring? How about the sample? Did you use a good sample that will answer your questions? So the entire research process is described, and the book has checklists, kind of an FAQ file, where you can compare the research you read against a checklist to see if the research is true, accurate, credible research, or hopefully not fake science.
When I was starting my career as an academic, I think we both came out at about the same time in the 90s. And
we're not going to say when.
No, just did, right?
Not precisely. Late 90s.
Yeah. So I remember I began my career teaching research methods to people who were not going to be PhDs. They were going to be practitioners. And I remember saying, you need to be an educated consumer of research. So this might not be what you do every day, but you need to be able to read it and judge it as fair. But are they able to read, a research report done by a consulting firm? Are they able to read that and know whether it's fake?
Well, that's an interesting point. The issue of reports by consulting firms. And I think a lot of the fake science problems come from a lack of transparency. Sometimes we don't know exactly what's under the hood of the research. For example, in a time of political elections and debates, we see a lot of surveys and polls being reported on TV. And one of the things that we hear is a response rate. So, for example, 50% of the respondents who were targeted answered our questions. And you think, wow, 50%, 1 out of 2, that's fantastic. But when you know more about the details of the study, let's say that in the sample you had 50% of women and 50% of men in the total population of the sample, but then your actual survey, 50% relies on every man from the population. So 50% sounds great, but you got every man and no women. So when you go deeper into the layers of how the research was done, you realize that maybe you shouldn't trust it. So the point is, how much transparency is there? When you see a report by a consulting firm, or you're watching the news, or you're reading a scientific article, are the details of how the study was done sufficiently transparent so that you can evaluate the quality of that research?
That's really interesting. Are you seeing examples of this in our field? Have you seen, picked up a research report, and you don't have to name names, but have you picked one up and said, oh, this could be questionable?
Yeah, I can name my own research because the thing is, science is self-corrective. So we improve things over time. So if I look at some of my articles from 20, 30 years ago, I cringe because now we know better. But the issue of transparency is really key. But when you think about what's causing some of these fake science issues, and there are two main factors. Number one, knowledge, skills, and abilities of the researcher. The researcher needs to know how to do research well. But the second factor, sometimes we don't look at, is motivation of the researcher to create that research. The motivation to create a report that says certain things or has certain conclusions. Let's say you do a diversity survey or cultural survey in your company, or customer satisfaction survey. What is the motivation of the person who wrote the report to say some things and not other things about the data? So you have to know how to do research well, but also want to report research in an accurate and reliable way. And sometimes we have a lot of conflicts of interest. And that's not just from consulting firms, but also from the part of researchers, because if you get your papers published, you get a job, you get promoted, you get funding for your research. So that's something that we really need to look into.
That is such a key issue, right? Helping people become educated consumers of research by merely understanding the motivation of the person who is, of research study that they're reading, whether it's the consulting firm, somebody trying to sell you something. I hate to say it, sometimes academics, like you noted, we do have a lot of pressure to publish, and bad things can happen when the pressure is too high. What else could we look for? So I love the idea of getting smarter about looking at the motivation of the person doing the study or reporting the results. What else should we look for?
Let me go back to this issue of transparency, which is really key. A couple of years ago, I was in Chicago, and Chicago is known for the restaurants. And so I was there with my wife and my kids, and I thought, all right, let's do something special. So I took them to a Michelin star restaurant. I'm not going to tell you how much it cost. It was quite high.
No, I can.
But it was a fantastic experience. So we sit down, we order our entrees, and we look at those plates, and they are perfect. Everything is in its place. The texture, the colors, the combination, perfect. My wife and I were saying, you know what? Maybe we should go back home and do this. Make this plate, make this dish back home. And it's like, there's no way we can ever do this because we don't know what happened in the kitchen. That chef went through 100 trials and errors until this looks so perfect. Sometimes when we look at these reports from consulting firms, sometimes when we read research published, even in the top journals, they looked at like
just a little too perfect.
just like the entree from the Michelin star restaurant. Everything is in place.
Right.
Every hypothesis is supported. There are no problems with the data. And guess what? You don't know what happened in the research kitchen. You don't have sufficient details. And if you want to do the same study, you can't because you don't know how it was done. And even if you try to do it, you might get different results, which is lack of replicability. So that's the problem. We need to truly understand what happened in the research kitchen.
I love that metaphor. It's really, it makes a lot of sense. So managers are busy. We don't have a lot of time. We need to rely on data, whether we get it from industry reports or consulting firms or academics. So they look at the transparency, they look at who's doing the research, just how is it a little too perfect? What is the sample behind it? Are there other things that we can look for?
I would say checks and balances.
Okay.
I wouldn't go to the level of auditing, but checks and balances. So do you have an internal researcher, part of your company, someone who might be able to help you without a conflict of interest issue, help you understand if the research was transparent? How about partnering with a local professor? Take your local professor to lunch and talk to them. And then maybe they can help you look at some of that research, and they can give you their unbiased third-party opinion about the transparency, credibility, and rigor of the research that was done. Because you cannot be an expert on everything, especially, it takes a long time to be trained as a researcher. So you have to rely on others to do that.
That is such a great suggestion. It's funny, we both do consulting, and we're both organizational psychologists. And I don't know if you've had this experience, but when I know I've got somebody in the client organization who is a PhD in organizational psychology, I get so happy. I'm so excited because I know they're going to ask tough questions, but I know they're going to ask the right questions to get to the truth of why a solution is better than others. So it gives me sort of great pleasure when I know that I'm going to get a lot of good questions.
Well, that's what top executives do in making decisions on a daily basis. You don't rely only on one source, only on one advisor, or only one report. So the same thing with research, but sometimes it looks so perfect that you're leaning towards accepting it the way it is. And you have to be more skeptical about it.
Yeah, confirmation bias, right?
That's right, confirmation bias, that's right. Because it looked like the French entree.
Yeah. So let's go back to, are there any organizations or contexts or where are there pockets of people doing this well? Would you say organizations doing it well either?
Sure. You mentioned organizational psychology. So there are many companies actually that employ PhDs in organizational psychology, not just to check on the accuracy of research, but also to implement best practices. Because frankly, the research we publish in our articles, it's narrow, it's technical, and it's not interesting or applicable, and not relevant in many cases, right? So it takes a long time for that research to reach out to practitioners. So you need that middle person, that person who's a boundary spanner, that person who is in the research world, is also in the practice world, so they can help you translate and adapt and use what's been published. Because as an executive, you don't understand. You're not supposed to understand that. It's technical.
Right. You had mentioned, I know you're saying it kind of as a joke, take your local academic to lunch and make those bonds. And I think we need to explore that. For the listeners of International Business Today, most of them are practitioners, and they should be partnering with academics to understand the quality of the knowledge that's being created on their behalf.
But before you do that, let me give you Google and Capital One are two companies that do that, because you asked me about specific examples. So Google, they employ PhDs in organizational psychology, and Capital One as well in economics and statistics and other fields to help them understand and interpret the latest research. I didn't want to evade your question about specific examples.
Those are really, really good. Can you share us a little, what are they doing? So what does Capital One do?
So Capital One is mostly about people analytics. They use the latest technology on how to predict performance. We know, for example, the interview is a horrible way to predict performance. And past behavior is not always a random sample of future behavior, which is what we do when we look at someone's resume or experience. We believe they will replicate the past into the future. So they look at other data to try to understand. And Google, they implement all kinds of practices in terms of performance management, team building, how to manage virtual teams, based on the latest research.
Mm-hmm. I know they've been doing great research, just themselves, like really conducting research on teams and the like, figuring out what's working and what's not. So even internally, they're doing some really, really good work. Are you seeing this more? You mentioned, the articles that are being retracted. Are you seeing country level differences where, if it's coming out of a certain country, be careful? Or is it pretty much globally, the pressure to publish is so high that it's kind of a universal thing?
So I've traveled, all over the world in more than 30 countries, but I'll give you the data based on that Nature article. They found that the largest number of retracted papers came from researchers in Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, China, and Russia. They didn't explain why.
No, that was going to be my next question. Why?
That's right. Exactly. But
Can you speculate?
Let's go back to the two issues that I said are the root cause for some of this fake science issue. One, knowledge, skills, and abilities. What kind of training do these researchers get in Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, China, and Russia in terms of how to do high-level research? Second, the motivation. What is the pressure to publish, even though you might not have a really good study that you can publish, but what's the pressure such that you engage in questionable research practices because you really need to get that paper published? And if you look at the training aspect, and second, the reward aspect, that might help us understand why in these countries you see so many retractions originating from these countries.
That's really interesting and fascinating. So I guess we think about resources, and academics are great partners with practitioners around this. But every time I see a colleague, not every time, but a lot of the times when I see an academic colleague presenting to a practitioner audience, you cringe a little bit because they can't communicate the way that a consumer of research needs to hear it. I think we have a hard time bridging that as academics. I'm sure you see this as well. How do we get better at, so this is, I guess, speaking to us as academics, how do we get better at sort of sharing value? And then the second question is, how can practitioners really get better at working with academics? Because that's a beautiful partnership.
Absolutely. So first I mentioned a suggestion for practitioners: invite professors or researchers to lunch. And here's a few suggestions for researchers. Number one, talk to practitioners. It's a two-way street to try to understand what are the issues that they care about. What are the questions they need to have answered? And guess what? If you do answer those questions, you might get money to the research. So that's a good motivation for the researchers. The other issue is we get sabbaticals. Every 6 years, professors get a sabbatical. And why don't you spend part of the sabbatical in a company? That will really help you understand what are practitioners thinking about, what keeps them up at night.
That's such a great idea. So to our International Business Today audience, I would encourage you that if you have a sabbatical available and you've taken your academic friend to lunch, maybe invite him or her to do some months with your company.
Absolutely. And also researchers can teach exec ed courses, executive education, that will really make you understand real quick what are the things that practitioners need. So there are many things you can do to reach out, broaden your perspective. And rigor is important, but relevance is also important. I mean, we see all this movement in society against higher ed. What is the value of higher ed? And is a degree worthwhile or not? What is the research being done? Let's go back to the motivation. It is in our best interest to the research that people care about, not just researchers, but people outside of academia, so that we enhance our value proposition. And then guess what? We might get more resources to do what we want to do.
If only. I have to ask this question about AI. I mean, how is that changing this world of fake science? And how can practitioners kind of detect if AI wrote an article, and is that a bad thing? I mean, maybe it's not. Give us a sense of that.
It's an arms race. It's an arms race. And we actually wrote a couple of papers on using AI as a research methods assistant. we wrote a paper on using AI as an human resource management assistant. And it's amazing what you can do, but it's a tool. And all tools can be used, can be misused, and they can be abused. So we talk about plagiarism as if it were a new thing. 30 years ago, you could go to the library and copy a book and turn it into something apparently original. Then with the internet, you could go to Google and copy text from the internet. And now AI can generate it. So this is really not a new thing. It's a new technology. And we need to learn how to use it to our advantage. So it's a tool. And as a tool, we need to use it for good purposes. But you can say the same thing about every technology. You can say the same thing about every new tool that we get as researchers.
Yeah. I remember years ago, I had one of my articles, and I'm sure you've had this as well. It shows up in some, online journal that doesn't really exist with someone else's name on it, word for word, top to bottom. It's amazing.
And before AI.
Right.
Way before AI.
Yeah.
So it's been happening for a while. Yeah.
Right. So any advice then, sort of thinking about rounding this out, any advice that you would give kind of in the spirit of global leaders who are out there and they're really trying to do the right thing. They are managing incredible amounts of uncertainty and ambiguity now. They need great knowledge. They need correct information. Kind of what advice do you sort of give them generally about finding information, even going beyond research, but just generally, how do you solve big problems now?
Number one, watch every single episode of International Business Today.
Clearly,
Number one.
That was without saying.
And number two, see what some of the researchers who are reaching out doing. For example, I have a YouTube channel, and I have more than 100 videos on the channel. Many of those videos are for practitioners, and in fact, talking about research issues and how to make research more user-friendly. So if you want to visit my YouTube channel, you can see videos on how to do that. And there are many professors who actually are very interested in making a difference in the world. And many of us were trained. Being a professor and a researcher is not just a job. It's really a calling. It's a calling. And what we want to do is make a difference. And we do that by reaching out to different audiences. So there are many, many professors throughout many business schools in the world who are really serious about that. So I encourage you to reach out to them because you will have a very good partner in these people.
It's such a nice way to think about it. And so I know you're kidding about international, joking about international, but it is actually the reason we started this podcast was create and disseminate knowledge that international business practitioners need. So that is so true. And we'll definitely put a link to your resources in the show notes. Do you also have other resources available that you want to share?
Well, books and articles, and they're also, this is something for practitioners to know. There are many journals in business, international business and management called bridging journals. And most of you might know Harvard Business Review, but there are many, many others like Organizational Dynamics, Business Horizons. These journals are for practitioners, but they are evidence-based, not opinion-based. This is not about, my 3 CEO friends said that this works, and here I'm going to tell you. No, these are articles based on research, on evidence, but written in a way that practitioners understand, and most importantly, they are short.
Right. I'm a huge fan of Work Dynamics too. That's one of my favorites. So Herman, you've lived and worked all over the world. Do you have any last piece of advice for global business leaders?
The world is changing very fast, and knowledge is being created in a very fast way. And what makes some firms more competitive than others? And it used to be the physical facilities, it used to be financial resources, it used to be the technology. Those things are no longer a competitive advantage. Any of those things, if you have them, your competitor will have them very, very soon. But the knowledge, the creativity, the motivation, and the engagement of your people, those are the things that will make you competitive in the long run. So what are the best practices in terms of selecting, recruiting, retaining, motivating those talented people so that they don't get poached away by your competitor? And I think to do that, you need to give them opportunities for growth, including teaching them or allowing them the time to learn AI and any other technology. And because these are the people who scan the environment all the time, and they're looking for opportunities for growth for themselves and for your firm.
And so many of those things you just said, AI can't replace, right? So, oh gosh. Herman, thank you so much for being on International Business Today. To our listeners, thank you for joining us for today's episode. If you enjoyed it, please share it with your network. As always, we'd love to hear from you.